What would you do if the moment you lost everything turned out to be the beginning of something you were never meant to find? At just 18, he was thrown out of his own home with nothing but a worn backpack and a silence that said he didn't belong anywhere. For weeks, he survived one day at a time until a single letter led him to a forgotten ranch in the middle of nowhere. But what he discovered there wasn't just land. It was a secret carefully hidden for years, one that would force him to question everything he thought he knew about his past, his family, and himself. So what exactly was waiting for him on that ranch? And why had it been kept from him all along? Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. Let's step into his story. The morning Ethan Cole turned 18 didn't feel any different from the ones before it. The same narrow kitchen, the same chip table, the same weak sunlight slipping through the blinds like it had somewhere better to be. His father sat at the table with a cup of coffee, staring down into it as if the answer to something important might be floating there. He didn't look up when Ethan stepped into the room. For a moment, nothing happened. No raised voices, no tension thick enough to cut. Just silence stretching longer than it should. Then, without warning, his father spoke flat, emotionless, as if he were reading from a line he'd already practiced in his head. "You're 18. Figure it out yourself." That was it. No explanation, no anger, no second sentence. Ethan stood there waiting. Not for an apology, he knew better than that, but for something else. A hesitation, a flicker of doubt. Anything that might suggest this wasn't final. But his father didn't move, didn't look up, didn't even blink. Behind him, Lydia, his stepmother, leaned quietly against the counter. She didn't interrupt, didn't argue. Her silence said everything it needed to say. Ethan nodded once more to himself, then to anyone else. No words, no questions. He turned, walked down the hallway, and grabbed the only bag he had, a worn backpack that had seen more use than care. He stuffed in what little he owned, a few shirts, a pair of jeans, a small folding knife, and a wallet that felt lighter every time he touched it. When he came back to the front door, he paused, just for a second. There was a strange, almost invisible hope sitting in his chest, one he hadn't invited, one he didn't trust. The kind that whispered maybe someone would stop him. Maybe his father would say something. Maybe Lydia would sigh and tell him to sit back down. But the house stayed quiet. Ethan opened the door, and when it closed behind him, the sound was sharp and final, like something breaking clean in two. He stood on the front steps for a moment, staring out at the same street he'd walked his whole life. It looked exactly the same. Cars passed. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere, a screen door slammed, but none of it belonged to him anymore. He adjusted the straps on his backpack and started walking. He didn't have a plan, just a direction away. The backpack hung heavier than it should have, even though there was barely anything inside it. A couple of clothes, the knife, a wallet with just enough cash to remind him how quickly it would run out. No phone worth keeping, no numbers to call even if he had one. He walked past familiar houses, past the gas station on the corner, past the grocery store where he used to stand in line behind people who had somewhere to be. Each step put a little more distance between him and the life he'd just lost. There was anger in him, but it didn't burn. It just sat there dull and heavy, like something too tired to fight. Underneath it was something worse, emptiness. He stopped once halfway down the road and looked back. The house was still there, same as always. No one came out, no one called his name. Ethan turned away. "I'm not coming back," he muttered under his breath. This time he meant it. The first job he found didn't ask questions. a small auto repair shop on the edge of town, half rust, half noise, and entirely uninterested in who he was or where he came from. The owner, Hank Miller, looked him over, once nodded toward a stack of tires and said, "You can start there. No paperwork, no contract. Just work." Ethan took it. Days blurred together quickly after that. He lifted tires until his shoulders burned, wiped grease from tools that would be dirty again. In minutes, crawled under cars that leaked oil onto his hands and arms. The smell of metal and fuel soaked into his clothes, into his skin. At night, he picked up extra work at a nearby stable, shoveling stalls, hauling hay, cleaning up after animals that didn't care whether he was there or not. His hand split open more than once. Skin toughened. Bruises came and went without notice. The pay was barely enough, but it kept him moving. Kept him from stopping long enough to think. He didn't talk much, didn't try to make friends. When someone asked where he was from, he shrugged it off or changed the subject. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. It wasn't living. But it was enough to keep him going. Hank eventually pointed to the back of the shop one night and said, "You can crash in the storage room if you need." Ethan didn't say thank you, just nodded. The room was barely a room. Concrete floor, metal shelves stacked with old parts, a thin mattress pushed into the corner like an afterthought. He lay down that first night and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Wind rattled the loose sheet metal on the walls, sending sharp clanks through the darkness. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once, and then went quiet again. No messages, no missed calls, no one wondering where he was. "Don't need anyone," he whispered into the dark. The words felt strange, but he held on to them anyway. Days turned into weeks. The routine didn't change, and the longer he stayed in it, the more it began to feel normal. The letter came on a day that felt no different from the rest. Hank called him out from the back of the shop, holding a sealed envelope between two fingers. "Got something for you," he said. Ethan took it, turning it over in his hands. Official stamp, Montana return address. He almost tossed it aside, assuming it was junk. But something about the weight of it made him pause. He opened it. The words inside didn't make sense at first. They felt too distant, too disconnected from anything in his life. Walter Cole, deceased, inheritance, ranch. Ethan read it again, slower this time. His grandfather. The name stirred something faint in his memory, a blurry image of being lifted onto a hoarse laughter he couldn't quite place a voice, he couldn't clearly remember. But that was it. Nothing solid, nothing real, and now somehow that man had left him something. A ranch. Cole Ranch. Located over 40 miles from the nearest town. Condition unknown. Value unspecified. Ethan stared at the page. It sounded like nothing. A piece of land too far from anywhere to matter. A responsibility disguised as an opportunity. Still, it was something. And more importantly, it was his. He sold what little he could. An old phone, a spare jacket, anything that wasn't essential, bought a bus ticket north. The ride stretched on for hours, the landscape slowly changing as the miles passed. Buildings gave way to open land. Roads thinned out. The skies seemed to get bigger with every mile. Ethan sat by the window, watching it all go by. For the first time since he'd left home, he didn't feel like he was just running. He didn't know where he was going exactly. But at least it belonged to him. "At least it's mine," he said quietly. The town was small. Smaller than he expected. From there, he rented an old truck that rattled more than it drove and followed the directions printed on the letter. The road turned from asphalt to dirt, from wide to narrow, from maintained to forgotten. And then he saw it. The sign leaned at an angle, the paint faded almost beyond recognition. Cole Ranch. The gate hung crooked. The fence beside it had long since given up trying to stand straight. Ethan drove through slowly. What waited beyond it wasn't a ranch. It was a ruin. The barn sagged under its own weight. Sections of the roof had collapsed. The fields were overgrown, the grass thick and wild. No tracks, no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there in years. He stepped out of the truck boots, hitting dry dirt. No sound greeted him, no movement. Just wind sweeping across the land like it owned the place. Inside the house it was worse. Dust coated everything. Windows were cracked. The sink produced nothing when he turned the handle. No electricity, no signal, nothing. Ethan walked back outside and stood in the middle of the yard. This wasn't an inheritance. It was a burden, a place that had already been forgotten. For a brief moment he thought about leaving, driving back to town, finding another job, pretending this had never happened. Maybe his father had been right. Maybe there really was nothing here. He went back inside anyway, dropped his backpack onto the dusty floor, looked around one more time. The silence didn't feel empty this time. Just waiting. He ran a hand through his hair and let out a slow breath. One night, he said under his breath. Just one night. But even as he said it, something in him shifted. Because deep down, whether he wanted to admit it or not, he knew that if he stayed through the night, he wasn't going anywhere. Why did his grandfather leave everything to Ethan and not his own son? Was it just a choice? Or was there a deeper secret hidden behind that decision? Tell us what you think, and don't forget to subscribe before we dive into the most intense part of the story. The first morning at the ranch came quietly, without ceremony, without comfort. Ethan woke on the dusty floor where he had fallen asleep the night before. The faint gray light of dawn slipping through cracked window panes. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. Then the silence reminded him. Not the silence of a house with people sleeping in other rooms. Not the silence of a place at rest. This was something else. This was the kind of silence that came from being forgotten. He pushed himself up slowly, brushing dirt from his shirt, his muscles stiff from the cold floor. His stomach tightened, not from hunger, but from uncertainty. This place wasn't a home. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Still, it was all he had. Ethan stepped outside, the air sharp and clean in a way he wasn't used to. The land stretched out in every direction, wide and empty, the horizon too far away to measure. The barn stood off to the side, sagging under its own weight, like it had been trying to hold itself together long after it should have given up. He stared at it for a moment, then started walking. If he was going to stay, even for one night, he needed to know what he was dealing with. The smell hit him before he even stepped inside. Rotting wood, damp hay, dust that had settled and stayed. The barn door groaned as he pushed it open, the sound echoing deeper than it should have, like the space itself hadn't heard movement in years. Light filtered in through broken slats, cutting thin lines across the interior. Ethan moved carefully, boots crunching against debris. Broken beams lay scattered across the floor. Sections of the roof had collapsed, letting the sky peek through in jagged openings. It looked dead, completely abandoned. Then he heard it. A sound so faint he almost missed it. A slow, steady breath. Ethan froze. At first he thought it was the wind slipping through the broken wood. But then it came again, low, rhythmic, alive. His eyes narrowed as he turned toward the far end of the barn. And there, in the shadows, something moved. He stepped closer, his body tense, every instinct telling him to be cautious. The shape slowly came into view. A horse, old, thin but not broken. Its coat, once strong and dark, was now streaked with gray and dust. Its mane hung uneven and tangled, but its posture, that was what stopped Ethan. It stood straight, balanced, steady, not the way a starving or abandoned animal should. The rest of the barn around it had collapsed in pieces, but the section it occupied, though worn, was still intact. The beams above it held. The floor beneath it was solid, like it had been built to last, like someone had made sure it would. The horse turned its head slightly, and their eyes met. Clear, alert, watching. Ethan didn't move for a few seconds. Then slowly he stepped forward. Most animals would have bolted, or at least flinched. This one didn't. It didn't step back, didn't show fear, didn't even shift its weight. It just watched him. The space between them shrank step by step until Ethan was close enough to see the fine details, the faint scars along its flank, the quiet strength still held in its frame. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered under his breath. This wasn't a wild animal. This wasn't something left behind. This was something that had been trained. Carefully, intentionally. The silence between them stretched, not empty. Recognizing, like two beings who didn't trust easily, choosing not to turn away. Ethan lifted his hand slowly and placed it against the horse's forehead. Cool, solid, alive. The horse didn't pull away. "You're still here, huh?" His voice was quiet, almost unsure. He glanced around at the ruined barn, the broken stalls, the emptiness that surrounded them. Everything else had been left to fall apart. But this one thing remained. Ethan exhaled softly. "Guess that makes you a ghost." The word lingered for a moment. Ghost. A survivor. A reminder. Something that refused to disappear, even when everything else did. The name felt right. That day, Ethan started working. Not because he believed in the place, not yet, but because doing nothing wasn't an option. He began with the barn, clearing debris, pulling loose boards free, stacking what could still be used. The work was slow, exhausting, but familiar. Something about it grounded him. As he moved through the space, he started noticing things he hadn't seen before. The stalls weren't random. They varied in size, some wider, some narrower. The spacing between support beams wasn't even, it followed a pattern. The flooring beneath certain sections was reinforced thicker than the rest. Ethan crouched down, running his hand along the wood. This wasn't thrown together. It had been designed. Carefully. With purpose. As the dust cleared, more details emerged. Marks on the wood. Small carvings easy to miss unless you were looking for them. Numbers, symbols, repeated patterns. Ethan wiped one clean with his sleeve, leaning closer. This is a system. On the wall nearby, old tack hung from rusted hooks. Bridles, reins, leather worn but intact. Each piece had markings too. Different stitching, colored thread, tiny symbols burned into the leather. Ethan pulled one down, turning it over in his hands. These weren't decorations. They were identifiers. He started grouping them instinctively, matching symbols, aligning patterns. And slowly, something began to take shape. A method, a structure. This wasn't just a place where horses were kept. This was a place where they were studied, trained, developed. Ethan looked around again this time, seeing something entirely different. Not ruin, not chaos, but the remains of something precise. The collapse happened without warning. Ethan had been pulling up a section of warped flooring near the far corner when the wood beneath his weight gave way. He barely caught himself in time, stumbling backward as part of the floor dropped with a sharp crack. Dust rose into the air, thick and choking. When it cleared, he stepped closer, peering down. Darkness, deep and quiet. A narrow wooden staircase revealed itself beneath the broken boards, leading down into something hidden. Ethan hesitated. No markings, no signs, no reason for it to be there unless it was meant to stay unseen. He grabbed a flashlight from his bag, clicked it on, and pointed it into the void. The beam barely touched the bottom. "Of course there is," he muttered. Then, without overthinking it, he stepped onto the first stair. The air below was different. Cooler, drier. Still. Each step creaked softly under his weight, the sound swallowed quickly by the space around him. At the bottom, the beam of light revealed a room that didn't belong to the ruin above. It was intact. Shelves lined the walls filled with notebooks, folders, and rolled-up papers. A large wooden table stood at the center, covered in maps and diagrams. Nothing here had been left to decay. It had been preserved. Ethan moved slowly, scanning everything. He picked up the nearest notebook and flipped it open. Handwriting, detailed, precise, entries describing individual horses, their behavior, their responses, their limits. He grabbed another and another. Training logs, breeding records, performance notes, photographs tucked between pages, horses mid-stride, riders leaning forward, dust kicking up beneath hooves. A small chest sat near the back wall. Inside, medals, certificates, old competition records. The name appeared again and again. Walter Cole. Ethan's breath caught slightly. What were you doing out here? Later that afternoon, back in town, Ethan searched what little he could on a weak connection. The results came slowly. Old articles, archived mentions. Walter Cole, the silent trainer. A man who had built champions out of nothing. And then nothing. No retirement announcement, no scandal, no explanation. He had simply disappeared. Vanished from the industry like he had never been part of it at all. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. "You didn't stop," he said quietly. "You just came here." That night, back at the ranch, he read deeper into the journals. And that's when he noticed it. A line. Written once, then again, and again. Sometimes at the top of a page, sometimes at the bottom, sometimes squeezed into the margins like it refused to stay contained. The boy deserved something better than this world. Ethan stared at it. The handwriting never changed. The pressure of the pen didn't waver. This wasn't a passing thought. It was a belief. And even without a name attached to it, he knew. For the first time in a long time. Ethan didn't feel invisible. It was another journal that confirmed the truth about Ghost. A final record, marked differently than the others. Detailed lineage charts, generations tracked carefully. At the bottom, a note: final carrier. Ethan's eyes moved slowly from the page to the barn outside, to the horse that had never left. "You're not just surviving," he whispered. "You're the last one. Not abandoned. Protected. Preserved." By the time Eleanor Hayes' truck rolled into the yard the next morning, Ethan already knew this place wasn't what it seemed. But he didn't know how deep it went. She stepped out like she had done it 100 times before. "You must be Walter's boy," she said. Ethan nodded. She looked past him toward the barn, then back at him. "Took you long enough to find it." She told him everything. About Walter being pushed out by his own family. About the offers he turned down. About the years he spent working alone, building something no one else believed in. "He wasn't crazy," she said firmly. "Just ahead of everyone else." Ethan listened without interrupting. And your father, she added, her voice tightening slightly. He came here once, wanted to sell it all, land, horses, everything. Ethan's jaw tightened, and Walter told him no. A pause. That was the last time they spoke. Eleanor looked at him carefully. He moved the ownership into your name years ago, she said. Ethan blinked. What quietly? Before any of this could be contested. Ethan felt something shift inside him. The letter. The ranch. The timing. This wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. It was planned. Carefully. Patiently. For years. Ethan looked out at the land, at the barn, at the horse that had been waiting. And for the first time since he'd stepped onto that property, he understood. This place hadn't been left behind. It had been waiting. The first sign that the past wasn't done with him came in the form of tires crunching over gravel. Ethan looked up from the fence he had been repairing, the sound cutting through the quiet like something out of place. A black SUV rolled slowly through the broken gate of Cole Ranch, its polished surface reflecting a world that didn't belong here. It stopped a few yards away. The engine shut off, and for a moment, everything was still again, except now it felt different. Tense. Waiting. The driver's door opened first. A man stepped out, straightening his jacket, as if dust itself offended him. Clifford Cole. Ethan didn't need an introduction. He had seen him once years ago in passing. But the resemblance was enough. The sharp features, the controlled expression, the kind of presence that didn't ask permission to take space, it assumed it already owned it. From the passenger side, a younger man stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. A lawyer, of course. Cliff's gaze swept across the ranch briefly, not with curiosity, but with calculation. Then it landed on Ethan. No greeting, no hesitation. You shouldn't be here, Cliff said. Ethan leaned back against the post he'd been working on, his grip tightening slightly on the hammer in his hand. This is my land, he replied evenly. Cliff gave a faint, almost amused smile. No, he said. It's family land. And you, he paused, eyes narrowing slightly, are not in a position to claim it. Behind Ethan, Ghost shifted slightly, stepping forward just enough to be seen. The horse didn't make a sound, didn't move aggressively, but it didn't back away either. Cliff's eyes flicked toward it for a brief second, then returned to Ethan. Your grandfather wasn't in his right mind when he signed those documents, he continued. Which means everything here is subject to review. The air tightened. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He just watched him. You're saying the will isn't valid, he said finally. I'm saying. Cliff replied calmly. He didn't know what he was doing. The lawyer stepped forward, opening his briefcase with a quiet click. We've filed a formal request with the court, he said. Given Mr. Walter Cole's documented cognitive decline, there's sufficient reason to question the legitimacy of the will. Ethan frowned slightly. Cognitive decline. The lawyer nodded. There are records of missed medical appointments, reports of memory lapses, behavioral inconsistencies. Cliff folded his arms. He was old, he said simply, and he was confused. Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. No, he said. He wasn't. Cliff didn't react. You weren't here, he replied. The words hung in the air, sharp, final. We've requested a temporary injunction, the lawyer added. Until the court makes a final determination, all assets associated with the ranch will be frozen. Ethan's jaw tightened. Meaning? Meaning, the lawyer said, you can't sell anything, leverage anything, or conduct any form of business related to the property. Cliff gave a small nod. You can stay, he said. For now. Then he turned as if the conversation had already ended. The official notice arrived 2 days later. Stamped, signed, legal. Cole Ranch was now under temporary restriction. Ethan read the document twice, then a third time, each line sinking in deeper than the last. No sales, no financial transactions, no use of assets for profit. Everything paused. What had felt like a fragile opportunity only days before now shifted into something heavier, something complicated, a responsibility he couldn't move forward with and couldn't walk away from. "This isn't over," he muttered quietly. No, it was just beginning. The money ran out faster than he expected. Feed for Ghost, materials for repairs, fuel. Every small expense added up. And now, with the ranch frozen, there was no way to turn what he had into something sustainable. Ethan sat on the steps outside the house one evening, staring out across the land. The wind moved through the tall grass in slow waves. The same land that had started to feel like possibility now felt uncertain again. He glanced toward the barn, toward the hidden room beneath it, toward everything he had uncovered. "Is this even mine to keep?" he asked quietly. For the first time since arriving, doubt crept in. Not loud, but persistent. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lit a small lantern and carried the journals out from the hidden room, stacking them on the table inside the house. If he couldn't move forward, then he needed to understand. Completely. He opened the first notebook and began reading. Hours passed, then more. Page after page, line after line. The entries weren't just technical, they were meticulous. Observations recorded with patience. Adjustments made with purpose. Mistakes acknowledged, corrected, refined. Walter hadn't guessed his way through this. He had built it, carefully, over years. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "This isn't just a ranch," he said quietly. It was a system. A complete self-contained structure designed to produce results. Predictable, repeatable, scalable. He flipped through another journal, then another. The realization settled slowly, but once it did, it didn't leave. Walter hadn't left him money. He had left him knowledge. The final journal was different. Thinner, older. At the very back, tucked between the pages, was a folded letter. Ethan opened it carefully. It wasn't addressed, but it didn't need to be. The handwriting was steady, clear. He read it once, then again. A buyer, an offer, a number large enough to change everything. Walter had been given a chance to walk away from all of it, to take the money, to live comfortably, to never worry again. Ethan swallowed. "Why didn't you?" His eyes moved to the final line. "If I sell this, he'll never have a reason to come back." The words hit harder than anything else he had read. Ethan lowered the page slowly. This wasn't about business. It never had been. He sat there for a long time after that. The silence felt different now. Not empty, not forgotten, but intentional. Walter hadn't just built something valuable. He had built something that would wait. For him. This wasn't luck, Ethan whispered. It was planned. Samuel Carter arrived 2 days later. His truck was older than the ranch, or at least it looked that way. He stepped out slowly, carrying a box under one arm, his expression calm but focused. "You must be Ethan," he said. Ethan nodded. "Walter's lawyer have been for a long time," Carter replied. He set the box down on the table inside the house and opened it. Files, documents, records. Walter left instructions, he said, in case anyone tried to challenge the will. Ethan leaned forward slightly. He knew this would happen. Carter gave a small nod. He anticipated it. The documents were thorough. medical evaluations confirming Walter's mental clarity, signed statements from professionals who had assessed him prior to the will being finalized. Every test shows the same thing, Carter said. He was fully aware of his decisions. Ethan exhaled slowly. "So this is enough, it's a start," Carter replied. Then he reached into the box again and pulled out a small device. "A recording," he said. He pressed play. Walter's voice filled the room, older but steady. "Clear. I am of sound mind," the recording said, "and I am making this decision willingly." Ethan froze. This ranch belongs to Ethan Cole, and no one else. Carter let the recording finish before turning it off. He wanted it to be undeniable, he said. The courtroom was smaller than Ethan expected. Plain, functional. Cliff sat across from him, expression unchanged, as if none of this had ever been in doubt. His lawyer began first, outlining Walter's age, his isolation, the supposed inconsistencies in his behavior. He missed appointments, the lawyer said. He withdrew from society. These are not the actions of someone in full control of their faculties. Ethan listened silent. Carter waited. Then calmly he stood. Medical records, signed evaluations, witness testimony, each piece laid out clearly, precisely. Then the recording. Walter's voice echoed through the room again. Firm, certain, unmistakable. Cliff's expression shifted just slightly. One by one, the arguments against the will began to collapse. There was no confusion, no uncertainty, only intent. Clear, documented, proven. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Cole," he said, looking at Cliff, "on what grounds do you continue to contest this will?" Cliff didn't answer immediately. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, he looked unsure. The ruling came quickly after that. The will was valid. The injunction was lifted. Cole Ranch belonged to Ethan. Ethan didn't celebrate, didn't smile. But as he stepped outside the courthouse, something in his shoulders finally eased. Not relief, not exactly. More like clarity. Behind him, Cliff walked out in silence, his confidence gone. There were whispers, already questions about documents he had submitted, discrepancies that didn't quite add up. An investigation would follow. But Ethan didn't turn back to look. He stood there facing the wide Montana sky, the wind moving freely across the open land. The fight was over. The first one, anyway. And now, for the first time, what came next was entirely up to him. The offer came only a week after the court ruling. It didn't surprise Ethan. Not really. Word had spread faster than he expected about the ranch, about the horses, about the name Walter Cole. The people in certain circles had never quite forgotten. The call came in the middle of the afternoon while Ethan was inside the barn, repairing a section of wall that still leaned more than it stood. His phone buzzed against the wooden beam beside him, the sound out of place in a space that had only recently begun to feel alive again. He wiped his hands on his jeans and answered. Ethan Cole. The voice on the other end was smooth, confident, used to being listened to. "My name is Richard Hale. I believe my firm made an offer to your grandfather some years ago." Ethan didn't respond right away. He remembered the letter, the journal, the line that had stayed with him long after he'd closed the page. "I'm aware," Ethan said. "Good," Hale continued. "Then I'll be direct. We're prepared to make a revised offer. Full acquisition of the breeding line, exclusive rights to the training system, and a purchase of the land itself." Ethan leaned against the stall, his eyes drifting toward Ghost, who stood a few yards away, calm and still watching him the way he always did. "The number we're prepared to offer," Hale added, "is significantly higher than what your grandfather declined." Ethan didn't ask how much. He didn't need to. It was enough. Enough to leave. Enough to start over somewhere easier. Somewhere smaller. Somewhere that didn't require rebuilding something that had taken a lifetime to create. He closed his eyes for a brief second. Then he remembered the line. If I sell this, he'll never have a reason to come back. Ethan exhaled slowly. It's not for sale, he said. There was a pause on the other end. I'm not sure you understand the scale of what's being offered, Hale replied. I do, Ethan said quietly. That's why I'm saying no. Another pause. Longer this time. Then the line went dead. Ethan lowered the phone and looked at Ghost again. For the first time in his life, he hadn't taken the easy way out. That evening he sat at the small table inside the house, a piece of paper in front of him, a pencil in his hand. For a long time, he didn't write anything. Then slowly he started making a list. Repairs, supplies, fencing, water system, training structure. It wasn't random. It wasn't survival anymore. This was a plan, a direction. He wasn't staying because he had nowhere else to go. He was staying because this was where he needed to be. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the page. This isn't temporary, he said under his breath. This was the beginning. The work started the next morning, and it didn't stop. Ethan tore out the parts of the barn that couldn't be saved, rotted beams, splintered board sections that had already given up. He salvaged what he could, stacking usable wood into piles, organizing materials the way Walter had organized everything else. He drove into town with what little money he had left, buying tools, nails replacement boards, only what he absolutely needed. Back at the ranch, he worked from sunrise to sunset. Some days it felt like nothing changed. Other days, entire sections came back to life under his hands. The fence was first. Post by post, he drove them into the ground, tightening the line that defined the ranch. It was slow work, physical, demanding. But with each section completed, something shifted. The land started to feel claimed again. The water system came next. He followed the diagrams Walter had left behind, tracing old lines through the dirt, digging where the maps told him to dig. The pipes were clogged in places, broken in others. But they were there, still waiting, still usable. Ethan cleared them piece by piece, reconnecting what had been severed, restoring flow where it had stopped. When the first stream of water sputtered back to life, weak but real, he stood there for a moment, watching it. Yeah, he said quietly. We're getting there. Eleanor stopped by more often than she said she would. Sometimes with food, sometimes with tools, sometimes just to stand there and watch the progress with a small, knowing smile. You're doing it the hard way, she told him once. Ethan shrugged. Only way I know. She nodded like that answer was exactly what she expected. Ryan Foster showed up a few days later, introduced by Eleanor, as someone who knew how to fix things that didn't want to be fixed. He didn't ask many questions. Just looked around, whistled once, and said, "This place ain't dead." Then he got to work. Together, they reinforced the main structure of the barn, replacing supports, stabilizing the roof, bringing it back from the edge of collapse. Day by day, the ranch changed. Not all at once, but enough to be seen, enough to matter. Ethan returned to the journals at night, studying them more carefully now, not just reading, but understanding. The breeding records were precise, generations mapped out, traits tracked, results measured. Walter hadn't left anything to chance. Ethan followed the system exactly. No shortcuts, no improvisation. Just step by step the way it had been designed. Ghost became the center of it all, not just a survivor, a foundation. The first foal was born in early spring. Small, unsteady, but strong. Ethan stood there as it took its first steps, his hands resting lightly on the stall door. A quiet smile crossed his face. "It works," he said softly. Ghost changed too. The thinness faded. Strength returned slowly, steadily. His coat regained its depth, his movements more controlled, more certain. He no longer looked like something left behind. He looked like what he had always been. The leader. Every time Ethan stepped into the barn, Ghost was there. Watching. Waiting. Not out of habit, but out of recognition. Their connection wasn't forced. It wasn't trained. It was built. Training came next. Ethan didn't rush it. He followed the principles Walter had written, even when they felt slower than what he had seen elsewhere. Observe first. Understand. Then guide. No force. No fear. Just trust. He learned to read small movements, the shift of weight, the tension in muscle, the hesitation before reaction. He used his hands more than tools, his voice more than commands, and slowly. The horses responded. Not perfectly, but honestly. People started to notice. At first, just a few locals passing by curious about the changes. Then more. A couple of trainers from nearby towns. They stood at the fence watching the sessions, exchanging quiet looks with each other. "This isn't standard," one of them muttered. Ethan didn't respond. He didn't need to. The results spoke for themselves. Cole Ranch was no longer forgotten. It was becoming something again. The idea came to him on a quiet afternoon, watching one of the younger horses hesitate under pressure, watching himself a year ago in the way it pulled back instead of forward. He leaned against the fence arms, cross-thinking. Then he made a call. A local youth support center. A simple proposal. "I've got space," he said, "and I've got work that needs doing." A week later, the first group arrived. 3 kids, quiet, uncertain, carrying more than they showed. Ethan didn't ask questions. Didn't need to. He knew that look. "You don't have to be perfect," he told them on the first day. They stood in the barn, unsure, watching him closely. Just don't quit. That was it. No speeches, no expectations beyond effort. They started small, cleaning stalls, carrying feed, learning how to approach a horse without forcing it. At first they were hesitant, then slowly. Something changed. A boy who barely spoke began guiding a young horse through its first controlled steps. A girl who avoided eye contact started writing notes, tracking progress, asking questions. They weren't just working. They were growing, the ranch filled with sound again. Laughter, movement, voices that didn't belong to the past. Ethan watched it happen from a distance, more often than not. He didn't insert himself into every moment. He didn't need to. This wasn't about him. It was about what this place had become. A second chance. For them. Just like it had been for him. One evening as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Ethan stood by the fence, looking out across the land. The sky burned orange and gold, the light stretching across the fields, touching everything it could reach. The barn stood solid now. The fences held. The horses moved freely in the distance. He rested his arms on the top rail, his gaze steady. He thought about that morning. The door closing. The silence that followed. The feeling of having nowhere to go. And then, this, if that hadn't happened. He said quietly, almost to himself. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. He already knew the answer. He wouldn't be here. Wouldn't have found this place. Wouldn't have understood what had been waiting for him all along. What had felt like an ending had been a beginning. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, letting the wind pass over him. Walter hadn't left him money. He hadn't left him comfort. He had left him something better. A foundation, a system, a place to start again. "You weren't too late," Ethan whispered. A soft sound behind him made him turn. Ghost stepped forward, stopping beside him. Calm, steady. Ethan reached out, resting his hand against the horse's neck. Together, they stood there watching the sun sink lower, the light fading slowly across the land. In the distance, the younger horses ran free, strung alive. Ethan didn't feel lost anymore. Didn't feel like he was standing on something temporary. This place, this ranch, wasn't just land. It was a promise. And for the first time in his life, it had been kept. 2 years changed everything. Cole Ranch was no longer a forgotten piece of land at the edge of nowhere. It had become a name people said with interest, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with disbelief. The broken fences were long gone. The main barn stood solid and bright beneath the Montana sky. The training ring was used from sunrise until late afternoon, and the sound of horses moving in rhythm had replaced the old silence that once clung to the property like dust. What Walter Cole had built in secret, Ethan had brought back into the light. The horses spoke first. They always did. A few of the younger ones from Ghost's bloodline began placing in state-level competitions, speed events, endurance runs, technical handling trials. Trainers from neighboring counties came to watch and left quieter than they arrived. The animals moved differently. They were alert without being anxious, disciplined without looking broken. They responded to hand signals, body position, tone. Ethan's methods, Walter's methods, were being noticed. People started calling it the Cole approach, though Ethan never gave it a name himself. Online short clips from weekend sessions began to spread. Videos of frightened horses calming without force. Clips of runaway teens learning to guide a restless colt with patience instead of fear. Local news stations ran small features. Then larger channels picked it up. A few reporters drove out to the ranch and left with stories about a young trainer in Montana who was proving that control didn't have to come from violence. Ethan didn't chase the attention. He barely even knew what to do with it. But it kept growing anyway. At some point he realized people had stopped talking about him as the kid who got thrown out at 18. They were saying his name like it meant something on its own. Ethan Cole, the young man who rebuilt a dead ranch, the trainer with the quiet horses, the one who never raised his voice and somehow still got the impossible done. Success, he would learn, did not arrive alone. It brought company. The email came first. Short, formal, clean. A representative from Hale Equine Holdings requested a meeting. Ethan recognized the name immediately. The same corporate group that had once tried to buy everything from Walter. The same people whose offer he had refused after the court case. He deleted the email. The phone call came the next day. He let it ring out. Then 3 days later, a black sedan rolled into the ranch at exactly 9 in the morning. Not an old truck, not a local vehicle. A car that looked polished even under a layer of road dust, like it belonged to another world, and only came here because it had been forced to. A woman stepped out first. Mid-40s, sharp gray suit, dark glasses, expression as flat as glass. Behind her came a younger man, carrying a tablet and a leather folder. They moved with the kind of confidence that suggested they were used to entering places they didn't own and talking like they already did. Ethan was in the training ring, working with a restless yearling. He didn't hurry. He finished the sequence, let the horse settle, and only then walked toward them. Ghost stood near the fence line, older now, but still commanding in that quiet way that made other horses seem less certain around him. The woman took off her glasses. "Mr. Cole," she said. "I'm Vanessa Reed, Senior Acquisitions Director for Hale Equine Holdings." "I know who you are," Ethan said. Her smile was thin and professional. "Then I'll save us both time." She opened the folder. "Our company is prepared to make a full acquisition offer." Ethan said nothing. The bloodline, the training structure, licensing rights to the methodology, brand integration, expansion under your leadership if you choose to remain involved. The younger man slid a printed sheet from the folder and held it out. Ethan didn't take it. Vanessa continued. "The figure is substantially higher than any previous offer ever made to your grandfather?" Still, Ethan said nothing. She watched him carefully. "This would be enough to ensure you never have to worry again. It would expand your work nationwide. It would give your methods reach far beyond Montana." Ethan glanced once toward Ghost, then back at her. "I already gave you my answer." Vanessa's expression didn't change. That was 2 years ago. And it's still no. Something colder entered her face then. Not anger, not disappointment. Just the removal of politeness. "You should think carefully before saying no to this much opportunity." Ethan's voice stayed level. "You should think carefully before asking again." For a second, the silence between them felt edged. Then Vanessa closed the folder. "We'll be in touch," she said. "No," Ethan replied. "You won't." They left without another word. Eleanor, who had watched the whole exchange from the porch, waited until the sedan disappeared down the road before she spoke. "They don't like being told no," she said. At first, nothing happened. Or at least, nothing obvious. Then, feed prices doubled. The supplier Ethan had used for more than a year suddenly claimed transportation issues, then stopped returning calls. A second supplier accepted a payment, then canceled delivery at the last minute. 2 scheduled training clients pulled out within the same week, both with vague excuses that sounded rehearsed. A contractor Ethan had almost hired to extend the South paddocks apologized awkwardly and said he'd taken another job, one that had apparently paid far too well to refuse. Then came the land sales. Parcels bordering Cole Ranch, small stretches no one had cared much about for decades, were quietly bought up by shell companies no one in town seemed to recognize. One by one, the spaces around the ranch began changing hands. Fences appeared where none had stood before. Survey markers showed up along dirt roads. Men Ethan didn't know started driving through the area slowly, often more than once, as if memorizing routes. It didn't take long for him to understand. They were tightening a circle, not by force, not openly, but deliberately. He stood with Eleanor near the north fence one evening, looking out over a freshly marked line on neighboring land. "They're boxing you in," she said. Ethan kept his eyes on the far field. Why? Because buying something is easier when you make the owner tired first. He said nothing. Eleanor looked at him sideways. And because men like that don't think refusal is final. They think it's a negotiation. Weeks passed and the pressure shifted again. This time it became harder to see clearly. A few new clients arrived, all of them polite, all of them interested, all of them asking too much. They didn't watch horses the way real horse people watched horses. They watched Ethan. They watched the board where he tracked progress. They asked how the classifications worked, why some bridles were marked differently, why the younger horses were separated in specific ways. One of them asked if the old basement room Walter had used was still intact. That question sat wrong immediately. Ethan smiled without warmth and said, "There's no public tour." The man laughed it off, but Ethan saw the disappointment flash across his face before it disappeared. Another visitor stayed after hours without permission. Ethan found him near the back section of the main barn, standing too close to the old concealed entrance beneath the flooring. "Can I help you?" Ethan asked. The man turned too quickly. "Just looking around." "You're done looking." After that, Ethan started locking more doors. He moved some of Walter's original journals to a safer place inside the house. He stopped letting strangers wander the property alone. The ranch still felt open, but now the openness had a thin layer of vigilance stretched across it. And then came the betrayal. The boy had only been there 6 weeks. 19, maybe 20. Quiet. Good with chores. Not great with horses, but willing to learn. Ethan had taken him on part-time because Ryan needed extra hands, and because the ranch had always made space for people who needed one more chance. His name was Noah. Ethan found out by accident. A phone left charging in the tack room. A screen lighting up with an outgoing file transfer before it went dark again. A subject line on an email draft. Attachments labeled in plain text, breeding charts, classification tables, progression logs. For a moment, Ethan just stared at the screen, not because he didn't understand what he was seeing, but because he did. Completely. When Noah came back in from the yard, Ethan was waiting. The phone sat on the table between them. Noah stopped cold. Ethan's voice was quiet. Too quiet. "How much did they pay you?" Noah looked at the phone, then at the floor. "I needed money." That wasn't the question. Silence. Ethan stepped closer. How much? Noah swallowed hard but said nothing. The silence answered for him. Ethan nodded once slowly. There was anger in him, but it was buried beneath something harder. Disappointment, maybe. Or clarity. "You need to go," he said. Noah finally looked up. "I never meant for anything bad to happen." Ethan held his gaze. "You already did it." Noah left within the hour. No shouting, no second chance. Just boots on gravel and a truck pulling away down the road. Afterward, Ethan went into the hidden room and stood there in the stillness staring at the shelves Walter had filled with years of work. The copied pages lay in his hands like a warning. This wasn't competition anymore. It wasn't business pressure. It was theft, not of money, of legacy. That night, he stood in Ghost's stall long after the barn had gone quiet. The old horse lifted his head when Ethan entered, then lowered it again when he recognized the footsteps. Ethan rested one hand against the wooden divider and stared into the dim light. For the first time in 2 years, a real sense of danger settled into him. Not the fear of losing a sale. Not the fear of losing comfort. Something larger. "They're not trying to buy this anymore," he said under his breath. "They're trying to take it." The answer came faster than he expected. A week later, in the middle of the night, Ethan woke to a sound that didn't belong. Metal, sharp, fast, then another, then the high-panicked scream of a horse. He was out of bed before he fully understood what had woken him. By the time he yanked open the door, the wind hit him hard, and so did the smell. Smoke. No. He ran. The main barn glowed from the inside, orange light, flickering through the slats. Horses were crashing against the stalls, hooves hammering wood, the whole structure alive with fear. Ethan grabbed the nearest hose and shouted for Ryan, who was sleeping in the bunkhouse after a late repair job. Lights came on across the ranch. Doors slammed open. Voices rose. When Ethan reached the main doors, he saw immediately that this was no accident. The outer lock had been cut clean. One of the side gates had been forced open. A line of accelerant trailed black and wet across the dirt just beyond the entrance. Someone had wanted chaos, and they had gotten it. The flames hadn't fully taken the barn yet, but one side wall was burning fast. Ethan and Ryan got water on it while the older teens rushed to move horses. The animals were wild with panic eyes, rolling bodies slamming into wood and each other. One mare came out limping, another bolted through the open paddock and vanished into the dark. "Get them clear," Ethan shouted. "Keep them moving." Someone cried out from the far side. A gate had jammed. Ethan ran toward it, smoke stinging his eyes. He got it open with a crowbar and sent two terrified yearlings stumbling into the night. Then he looked for Ghost. He wasn't in his stall. Ethan turned in a circle, heart pounding so hard it blurred his vision. Ghost, no answer. Just smoke. Noise. Firelight. Then he saw the marks outside the rear access gate, deep dragging lines in the dirt tire tracks, cutting sharp through the mud, the broken hinge hanging loose. No, Ethan breathed. Then louder, panic now. No. Ghost was gone. Whether he had been taken or had gone after the others, Ethan didn't know. But the gate hadn't opened itself. The tracks were too clean, too controlled. By dawn, the fire was out, but the damage remained. Part of the barn had blackened and collapsed inward. Several horses were injured. 2 were still missing. The youngest kids huddled together near the house, pale and shaken. One of them was crying silently, fists pressed against his eyes, like he was trying to hold himself together through force alone. The police came, took statements, took photographs, made notes. They asked practical questions in practical voices, but Ethan could see it in their faces without witnesses, without security footage, without someone careless enough to leave evidence behind. This would become another file in a drawer. He stood in the wreckage long after they left. Ash clung to his shirt. Blood, not all of it, his dried dark across one hand where he'd cut himself on broken metal and never noticed. Smoke soaked into everything. 2 years. 2 years of work, of structure, of trust, of rebuilding. And all of it had nearly been broken in one night. He lowered himself onto an overturned bucket in the empty section of the barn and stared at the stall where Ghost should have been. The silence there was unbearable. He remembered the first morning, the breath in the dark, the old horse standing in the shadows, like the last living piece of something larger than ruin. Now the stall was empty. For the first time in a very long time, Ethan let the question come. Was I wrong to stay? No one answered. Maybe this was never meant to last, he thought. Maybe some things only survive in secret. Maybe dragging them into the open had doomed them. He sat there until the light shifted, until footsteps approached. One of the kids, Maya, 16, stubborn and sharp-eyed, stopped a few feet away. She looked at the ruined barn, then at Ethan. "You told us not to quit," she said. Ethan didn't move. Maya swallowed but kept going. "You said that was the rule." For a second, he just looked at her, then passed her to the others, helping Ryan gather supplies, to Eleanor, speaking quietly with one of the younger boys, to the people who had not left even after the fire. Something inside him steadied. Slowly, Ethan stood. He looked around at the shattered boards and the soaked dirt, the smoke-stained air. "Then we rebuild," he said softly. He drew a breath. Again. And this time, he didn't rebuild alone. Eleanor came back before noon with coffee bandages and enough practical anger for 3 people. Ryan returned with 2 more men and a trailer full of lumber. The kids stayed. None of them ran. None of them asked whether the program was over. They simply started helping, lifting debris, sorting tools, checking fences, carrying water. That was when Ethan realized something he hadn't fully seen before. Cole Ranch was no longer his burden to carry by himself. It had become a place other people claimed too, not legally, not financially. But in the only way that mattered: when things fell apart, they showed up. Still, rebuilding the barn was not enough. Ghost was missing. And Ethan knew that if the horse had been taken, there would be a reason. He started with the tracks, then with the cut gate, then with what Walter had once taught through ink and pattern rather than direct instruction. Ethan brought out the old classification notes and studied the small identifying marks used on tack and hoof wraps. One detail caught his attention, a specific knotting style left on one of the straps near the broken gate. Not random, not local. Corporate barns often used standardized fastenings. Walter had once written that people who industrialize animals always leave uniform behind. Ethan followed the little signs. A transporter seen on a county road before dawn. A fuel receipt found in the mud by accident. A stable hand at a large training facility 40 miles south who mentioned too casually that a new old stallion had arrived under unusual security. The place belonged through layers of ownership and legal distance to a partner network connected to Hale Equine Holdings. Of course it did. Ethan didn't bring a weapon. He brought copies of the stolen files, the messages from Noah's phone photographs of the cut lock, and 2 witnesses willing to testify about the suspicious visitors and the sabotage leading up to the fire. Eleanor insisted on coming. Ryan did too. Ethan told them both no, then gave up when they ignored him. When he arrived at the facility, Vanessa Reed met him in the yard, perfectly composed as always. "You're trespassing," she said. Ethan held her gaze. "You stole from me." Her expression barely shifted. "That's a serious accusation." He stepped closer, but kept his voice even. "You didn't understand what you were trying to take." He handed the folder to the attorney who had come with him, a local litigator Carter had recommended after the court case. "Open it," Ethan said. "All of it." Inside were the copied files, metadata traces, payment transfers tied to Noah, and records linking the Shell land buyers to Hale subsidiaries. More than enough to bring press regulators and law enforcement into the conversation. Vanessa's face finally changed. Not much, but enough. Then Ethan saw him. Ghost stood in a side enclosure, saddled, agitated eyes hard with frustration. A trainer tried to lead him and got nothing but resistance. The old horse's ears pinned back, body tense, refusing every cue. Ethan walked toward the fence. Ghost. The horse's head snapped up. Everything changed in an instant. The tension broke. The eyes softened. Ghost stepped forward once, then again, then let out a low sound from deep in his chest that Ethan had never heard from him before. Recognition. Relief. Ethan climbed through the gate before anyone could stop him. Ghost came straight to him, pressing his head against Ethan's shoulder with enough force to stagger him half a step. Ethan closed one hand against the horse's neck and shut his eyes for a second. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'm here." No one else in that place could make Ghost move. But when Ethan turned, the horse turned with him. Calm, certain. Like the whole stolen distance between them had vanished the second the voice returned. That was the image the cameras caught when local media arrived faster than Vanessa expected. The old stallion refusing everyone but the man he belonged with. The files, the sabotage trail, the corporate pressure campaign, the stolen system, the attempted seizure of something never truly understood. Publicly, Hale Equine Holdings denied wrongdoing. Privately, they started backing away within 48 hours. Contracts were dissolved. Statements were revised. Vanessa disappeared from the story almost overnight. But the damage had been done to them this time. And to Ethan, something else had become clear. Cole Ranch could not remain only a hidden refuge with a fragile perimeter. Not anymore. If Walter's system was going to survive, it needed protection through visibility, through structure, through making it bigger than something one company could corner in the dark. So Ethan expanded, not recklessly, not for vanity. He built a formal training center with documented standards rooted in Walter's journals. He worked with Carter's network and a small team of ethical trainers to codify the system without stripping its soul. The youth program grew from a local effort into a state-recognized model, then into a national partnership serving teens who had fallen through every other crack. Ranches in other states began adapting parts of the curriculum under license not for profit first, but for continuity. Walter's work, once hidden beneath a collapsing barn, became something living and protected because it was finally shared the right way. Years later, Ethan stood in the same upper pasture where Walter had once stood in old photographs. Below him, the ranch moved with the steady rhythm of purpose. Young trainers worked the ring. Kids who had arrived angry or numb now moved with patience beside horses that mirrored exactly what they brought into the space. Ghost, older, still grazed near the fence line, like a quiet king surveying what had outlived every attempt to erase it. Ethan watched the next generation working below and thought of all the ways this could have ended differently. A door closing, a letter never opened, a barn left buried, a horse never found, a fire that finished the job. Instead, the place endured, then grew, then became something no one man could steal. He rested his hands on the fence and let the wind move across the field. "He didn't just give me a place to come back to," Ethan said quietly. Below, one of the younger boys laughed as a filly finally responded to a hand cue he'd been practicing all week. Another teenager, once too withdrawn to speak above a whisper, stood nearby, teaching a newer student how to breathe before asking the horse to move. Ethan smiled faintly. He gave me a place others could find their way to. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If it moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently, please take a moment to subscribe and support the channel. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories like this to life.